My name is Barbara Altman. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. We're the sponsor of tonight's event. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's Clark Lecture for 2010-2011. It's part of our Sustenance series at the center this year. Before I present our guest, Richard Louv, a quick word about the lectureship that he holds here today. The annual Center Robert D. Clark Lecture, which was established in 1994, was begun with a gift from the Bowerman family. The goal of the lectureship is to, I quote, promote public discussion on the natural sciences, the history of Oregon, and the interface between science and social and cultural affairs, as exemplified by Thomas Condon, legendary frontier missionary, geologist, paleontologist, and founding member of the UO anthropology faculty, unquote. The lectureship is named after former UO President Robert D. Clark, who wrote a biography of Condon titled The Odyssey of Thomas Condon. I think Clark would have been very much in agreement that tonight's guest is an eminent and worthy Clark lecturer. A couple of practical matters. First of all, on your seat, you will have found a comment sheet. This is Exhibit A. Please do take the time to fill it out if you would. It's very helpful for us to know how you heard about our lectures because we want to be able to find and then serve our audience to the best of our ability. As an incentive, we're going to hold a book drawing. Now, I just lent my copy of the book to the author himself who wanted to look something up quickly, but maybe Mr. Louv will hold up the book. So there it is, and we're going to raffle it. So if you'd like to enter the drawing, please fill in that slip of paper. And we will gather them all at the door after the talk. There are boxes into which you can put them near the doors, and we'll also have a box for them at our staff table, our information table in the lobby, and various staff members will be carrying them around as well. So please give us your feedback and let us know how to reach you if we draw your name on Friday. I think we'll do it Friday, why not? And then we'll get in touch if you're the winner of the book. Richard Louv also asks us to ask you to make use of that form for one other thing. If you are interested in being on the email list of his organization, Children and Nature Network, you can write your email address and indicate CNN for Children and Nature Network on your form. The Oregon Humanities Center will collate that list and send it to Mr. Louv, and he will add you to the email list for his organization. So lots of useful things to do on that piece of paper. The second practical item is that the speaker will take questions after the talk, and he says the question and answer is his favorite part of the evening. If you would like to ask a question, there are 2 mics in the center aisle. Please do come to a mic because the talk is being recorded and we want to make sure that we can capture your question as well as the answer. If you have mobility issues, we can bring you a cordless mic so you can raise your hand and one of our staff members will bring a mic to you. We would, of course, appreciate it if you would keep your questions relatively short so that we can accommodate as many people as possible. After Mr. Louv's talk, there is a book signing and sale in the lobby. You will have walked past the book table as you came into the talk, and it's right on your way as you exit again. So if you'd like to stay and buy a book or have your book signed, please do that. Fourth practical item is I'd like to acknowledge the Humanities Center staff, without whom this kind of lecture simply wouldn't happen. My thanks to our Associate Director, Julia Hayden, and much appreciation as well to Melissa Gustafson for all the logistical work, to Peg Gearhart for the publicity, to Lindsay Hendrickson Rogers and Jonna Ireland who field inquiries, post posters, get the word out there, and are helping with logistics tonight. And now finally, an introduction to our wonderful speaker. Richard Louv is a widely published journalist, the author of 8 books, and chairman and co-founder of the Children and Nature Network. Since the publication in 2005 of his book, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, he has given innumerable interviews and talks on this topic that has struck a chord with a great many. Last Child was an immediate international success, generating, as he told me this afternoon, even more attention than he had expected. Now, just a little more than 5 years after publication, it has been translated into 10 languages other than English and published in 15 countries, which is some measure of the urgency of the issue and the importance of the work. Many of you in the audience will already know the book, those of you with a copy under your arm. In case you've not yet had the pleasure, a short quotation from the back cover will give you the gist of the argument. In Louv's own words, quote, "The children and nature movement is fueled by this fundamental idea. The child in nature is an endangered species, and the health of children and the health of the earth are inseparable." No doubt, at least in part, as a result of the impact of Last Child in the Woods, Louv has been the recipient of, among many other awards, the National Audubon Society's Audubon Medal, the Clemson University Cox Award for 2007, given for sustained achievement in public service, the 2008 San Diego Zoological Society Conservation Medal, the 2009 George B. Rabb Conservation Medal from the Chicago Zoological Society, and the 2009 International Making Cities Livable Jane Jacobs Award. He was also recently named co-chair of the Canadian Children and Nature Alliance. Louv's new book, The Nature Principle, Human Restoration and the End of Nature Deficit Disorder, follows as a broader continuation of the theme and addresses the need for adults, as well as children, to reintegrate with nature and its restorative power. It will be available in print and for sale as of next month, with a May 10th release date, and it is on this material that Mr. Louv will be speaking tonight. We're fortunate to catch Louv just as he's preparing to launch a multi-city book tour for the Nature Principle, and we in Eugene will be among the first to hear him on this new topic. Please help me welcome Mr. Richard Louv.
I told her that right before I came here, I was getting ready, and instead of hairspray, I used eyeglass cleaner. So how do I look? Yeah, very clean, I'm sure. And I also have to apologize. I don't use PowerPoint. Thank you. I have experimented recently with PowerPoint. I'm no longer a PowerPoint virgin. I'm not sure PowerPoint respected me in the morning, but I used it twice. The first time it went okay. I was required to use it. And the second time, I thought I was pretty good at it, and a slide was behind me, and I stepped out in front of the stage, and I was kind of talking passionately about what was on the slide. Little did I know that the screensaver went on, my screensaver, and it was my wife and I on a beach in Mexico. She looked really good. I didn't. And it went on for a long time, and nobody told me. You know? So now I've retrenched. I'm not so sure about PowerPoint. I'm going to start just by talking some about children and nature, and then I want to shift a little bit to the new book, which is more about adults and nature. It'll be the first time, really, in front of an audience that a large audience that I've talked about the new book. I don't have my mantra down, so I hope you'll be forgiving. Let me first read a quote from Mary Brown from Oregon. Dr. Mary Brown is a great pediatrician. She lives in Bend. She's been a pediatrician for about 30 years. I read this quote a few months ago to about 3,000 pediatricians, and this was in San Francisco. I was asked to be the keynote speaker, the plenary keynote for the American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference. This was a big deal because the medical profession is not easy to convince on this issue. They often ask me, well, where are the 30-year longitudinal studies? And I'll say, well, where were you 30 years ago when you should have started them? You know, this is a terribly under-researched area. Now, there's a lot more research in the last dozen years, and it's increasing in number, these studies. Most of the studies are correlative, not causal. So I'm always careful to say these studies indicate or these studies suggest strongly. I don't say they prove it. But these studies are coming in increasing numbers, and almost all of them point in one direction, which is nature experience is really good for children's health and well-being, their mental health, their psychological health, and it's really great for adults too. In fact, more and more studies have been done on adults, which I'll talk about later. Mary Brown, as I said, is a pediatrician in Bend. She wrote me an email about 2 days before I was supposed to speak to these 3,000 pediatricians. And I'll read you what I told them. More than 3 decades ago, when Mary Brown's children were growing up in Bend, Oregon, she describes it as a city at the base of the Cascade Mountains with a world-class fly fishing river running through it and where the sun shines over 300 days a year. It never occurred to her that much of her practice as a pediatrician would one day be so focused on childhood obesity and depression. These are maladies, she wrote me, quote, that happen when kids move inside and interact with their video games and computers instead of outside playing with each other and using their imaginations. Dr. Brown, by the way, is a member of the board of the directors of the American Academy of Pediatrics. She went on. Just this week, I saw a teenager who attempted suicide who had no friends, no activities, and no ideas about how to change her life. Her life had been moving from place to place with nothing but a computer for a friend. A month ago, Mary Brown wrote, I saw a 13-year-old boy who weighed over 300 pounds who told me if he didn't have his video games, he would have no reason to live. And she wrote, last weekend, it was 75 degrees and sunny, and I went for a long walk through several neighborhoods that were safe, with open spaces and endless opportunities for outdoor activities. And I was not able to find one child outside looking for lizards, butterflies, or playing with other kids. The disconnect with nature, as she wrote, with the real world is one of the core reasons for so many of the physical and mental problems that have changed the practice of pediatrics over the last 20 years. We now call them millennial morbidities. For many pediatricians, Dr. Brown added, the strategic pediatric priorities have changed from infectious diseases, immunizations, and car seats and helmets to mental health, obesity, and early brain development, all of which could be changed, she wrote, by reconnecting our kids to the wonder of nature. She believes, and I believe, that pediatricians can play a vital role in the movement to reconnect children to nature because they so often see the symptoms of what I've called nature deficit disorder. Now, when I spoke to the pediatricians, I was very clear, as I am in the book, nature deficit disorder is not a known medical diagnosis. Perhaps it should be someday, but it's not now. And what I asked the pediatricians to consider was not, at first I told them what I was not going to ask them to do. I was not going to ask them to have an official position on the benefits of nature for children as an academy, the American Academy of Pediatrics. What I was going to ask these pediatricians to do was to use their own individual judgment and wisdom and decide whether or not they should prescribe nature to their families that they see. So many of us are not treated as individuals anymore. We have to wait for an official sanction from some official national or international or local organization. In truth, we all have some wisdom and common sense. And that's really what I'm asking you tonight to do, not only for children, but for adults, for yourselves. I have a friend in Seattle who told me that, Rich, you're the person you wrote the Nature Principle for, the new book. And in fact, I have nature deficit disorder. I feel that I spend very much less time in nature than I should. I'm on airplanes a lot. I'm doing this a lot. The last 5 years have not exactly been conducive for fishing. So I'm not pretending to be an expert in my own life on this. I need to do it more too. And I know when I've not had enough nature. I bet some of you have the same self-knowledge. I get a little squirrely when I haven't had enough nature. And I have to have it. I have to have it. And when I get it, I feel better. In writing the nature principle, as with Last Child, but in writing the nature principle, it was a much harder book to write than Last Child. But I came to the conclusion that setting all the studies aside for a second about all the health benefits, the benefits to the ability to learn, the benefits to a sense of community. Communities can actually be more civil if there's more nature in them. That's what some of the studies are showing. All of that aside, what is it that we want most of all? I think we want to feel more alive. Now, not everybody wants to feel more alive. We want to feel better. We want to feel good. We live in a society which increasingly, most of what is coming at us, I think, much of it electronic, and I'm not anti-tech, purely anti-tech. I love my iPhone too much. But much of what is coming at us every day is not making us feel better. You know, tonight, sit in front of the television and flip for a while. We all get trapped into that, or not. Some of you are wiser than I and don't have televisions. But, you know, how you feel after you flip for a while late at night, watch the channels go by. Monitor how you feel. I guarantee you won't feel better than when you started. You'll feel kind of depressed. You may even have a sense of despair. What is coming at us every day is coming from every direction. Go through an airport. Try to escape the television monitors. Go get gas for your car. You know, have any of you ever wanted to pick up something heavy and bash that television screen above the gas where you put gas in your car that's squawking at you? Even in the stores, I mean, the advertisers are learning how to put advertisements on eggs. Holographic advertisements. The people who are in charge of marketing and advertising have realized that they can't capture us like they used to on television or in newspapers, et cetera, because there is so much media. So the only solution to that, they see, is total immersion. Total immersion. Seeing advertisements and messages, advertising messages where we least expect them. That is coming at us all the time, nonstop. I would ask you next time you sit in front of a computer, and I love my Mac, but next time you sit in front of a computer, ask yourself, how many senses are you using at the same time as you're looking at that monitor? I bet you're not using all of your senses. One of the arguments that I make for why the studies show that kids learn better when they go outside is that other than a New York subway, when else are you using all of your senses at the same time as you are in nature? Sit in front of a computer, and I love my computer, but sit in front of a computer or look at your iPhone and ask yourself, how many senses are you using? Are you feeling fully alive at that point? One of the people I quote in Last Child was an editor at the San Diego Union Tribune, where I wrote a column for many years. He talked about taking his son out to the mountains east of San Diego, where it's very wild out there. San Diego actually is although Riverside may have just passed us, but San Diego County is the county with the most species in the United States. It has more plant species than the entire state of Alaska. People are often surprised by this, but it has many microclimates. It has ocean, it has Mexico, it has mountains, it has deserts. So it's a very biodiverse place. And threatened, but very biodiverse. It also has large predators. So my friend, the editor, was taking his son out, and they were hiking. And he looked down at one point, and he saw mountain lion tracks. They kept hiking. And on the way back, they saw another new set of mountain lion tracks. And he realized what was happening, that mountain lion was either following or circling them. He said they got back to the car, they got in the car, and he sat there clutching the steering wheel. And he said he couldn't remember a time when he had felt more alive. And then he headed back to his computer. In the first chapter of the Nature Principle, I start with a story. The chapter's name is Singing for Bears. I would have loved that as the title for the book, but the publisher wouldn't go for it. The reason I call it Singing for Bears is because I've spent several summers going up to Kodiak and taking my younger son, who loves to fish, is a very good fisherman, to Kodiak, where we fish for salmon. And there are a lot of bears up there, big Alaskan brown bears. And they're the kind that invite you over for lunch. And you don't want to mess with them, obviously. Some of them can get up to 1,200 pounds or more. And there are a lot of them. And so one day we're going up this stream, small stream, overgrown with trees and bushes. And the guide that was with us taught us a lesson. The main thing, we already knew this, is that you don't want to surprise a bear. That's the main thing. So when you're fishing, you talk loud, you whistle, you sing for bears. And you let them know you're coming. So we're going up the stream. And the guide says, I'm going to teach you something new. I'm going to tell you how to smell for bears. And he did. And once you've smelled that smell, and some of you have smelled it, you never forget it. It's this strange mixture of musk and rotten salmon, because they love to roll in the salmon. So we're going up this stream, and he said, and this is Bear Kitchen, by the way. This is where the salmon go to die, and you know that being in Oregon. And he said, if you smell that smell, that means one of two things. Either the bear is right there in the bushes, and you can't see him, or the bear has just left. My son's comment was, well, this sure beats high school. It turns out, a few years ago, there was a study done of human beings, and they found that we have some bloodhound in us, that we can literally track with our noses. Now, physiologically, we have that ability, but we've forgotten it. And it makes you wonder how many other senses, how much other parts of our life we have been disconnected from. The people who study senses now, they don't talk about 6 senses anymore, or 4 senses or 5 senses. They talk about, some of them believe that there are as many as 30 senses that human beings have, and some of them have strange names. Some of them have to do with your sense of where you are in the universe, or in kind of where your position is, your bodily position. You sense what's around you, etc. Some of them are quite obscure, but they're very interesting. I think that the farther we get away from the natural world, the farther we get away from the full use of our senses, and the less alive we feel. Now, if kids never have a chance to feel that alive, what are we doing with them? If they spend their days in a cubicle called a classroom, told to sit still, having had the school district cancel recess, which more and more school districts have done, and cancel field trips, and then they test them again and again and again, And the kids that act out, they must have attention deficit disorder. Now, some kids need Ritalin. I'm not a radical on Ritalin. Some kids need medication, I believe. But what proportion of the number of kids that are placed on Ritalin or other stimulants like that actually need something else? What proportion of the huge increase in the number of kids placed on these stimulants might have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from them in the first place? Over 100 studies show the calming effect of nature. In some schools, 30% of the boys are on Ritalin. It's mainly boys. Studies at the University of Illinois, meanwhile, show that kids who have the symptoms of attention deficit disorder, and I say carefully, the symptoms of attention deficit disorder, those symptoms get much better, even kids as young as 5 years old, with just a little bit of contact with nature. These are inner city kids in the projects that they're looking at. A walk through trees, a walk in a wooded park, the symptoms get better. The people doing those studies say that nature therapy ought to be added to the other two traditional therapies for attention deficit disorder, which are behavior modification and Ritalin and other stimulants. I agree with them that nature therapy should be added, but I would also ask that question. What proportion of the huge number of kids that are now being placed on medication need something else? A couple years ago, I was in a hotel room in San Francisco, and I picked up one of those magazines, and that you always wonder where they come from in the room, in the hotel room. This one was San Francisco magazine, and on the back page, there was this wonderful photograph of a little boy on a beach. And he was running along the beach, and his arms were outspread, and he was looking away at the beach at the photographer, and these gray, dark waves were coming in, and there was a storm out at sea, and the kid's eyes were filled with life. And the story next to the little boy's picture talked about how this little guy had a problem. He had the wiggles. He couldn't sit still in class. He was disruptive. The school finally kicked him out. Now, the parents were good parents, and they'd been very observant about their little boy, though. They had already noticed how being in natural settings helped their little boy focus and calm himself. So for the next 10 years, they took their little boy all over the West to some of the great western wilderness areas. And the little boy turned out okay. The photograph was taken in 1906, and the little boy's name was Ansel Adams. So a couple questions. One is, what would have happened to little Ansel if they'd put him in a cubicle called a classroom, given him Ritalin, and told him to sit still, and never given him the gift of nature? Would he have given us the gifts of nature that nature ultimately gave him? Would we have the support for the national parks that we do today and the great wilderness areas of the West if it were not for Ansel Adams and that gift of nature? The other question is, how many other little Ansels and Anselettes are out there right now who could give us great gifts in the future if we give them the gift of nature? The studies, of course, show great benefits. Now, this is occurring, the discovery of these great benefits is occurring at the precise moment that we're discovering this historic break between children and nature. It's generational change. Without going into the statistics, the amount of time that kids spend in nature has been plummeting for about 20 to 30 years, plummeting. Kids spend most of their lives under essentially protective house arrest. The Kaiser Family Foundation, again, I'm not anti-tech, and I'll explain more about that later, but the Kaiser Family Foundation in northwestern Foundation did a study a few years ago and found that kids were spending about 44 hours a week plugged into some kind of electronic medium, more hours than some of their parents' work outside the home. A couple years ago, they updated the study, and the researchers were astonished. They found now that kids spent over 53 hours a week plugged into some kind of electronic medium, and they were stunned because they didn't think there were that many more hours in the week that kids could spend with electronics. I don't think that talking about this and considering this as a serious topic is an exercise in nostalgia, which some people have said. I'll plead guilty to romanticizing certain parts of my boyhood in the woods. But you have to consider that for all of human history and prehistory, human children went outside and either played or worked in nature for their developing years. And within the matter of about 3 decades, we're seeing such a sudden change in childhood that it has to have repercussions. Bill McKibben, the great nature and environmental writer, did a great blurb for the back of Last Child, and he said, and I agree with him, that this may be one of the greatest experiments in human history, and we don't know the outcome. We're experimenting with our kids. We're experimenting with future generations. We don't know that this childhood that we've created for them is better. If you begin to look at some of the studies that show how great nature is for kids, you have to ask, what is it we're taking away from them? In terms of physical health, we all know about the obesity epidemic. This morning, as I arrived here in Eugene, on the tarmac, as I got off, I got a call from a reporter from the Salt Lake paper. And there's a new study out from some folks in Utah that says that the kind of video games where you stand in front of the screen, you dance, or you jump around, or you box, or you shoot, or whatever you're moving, actually is better exercise for kids than walking. What was fascinating is that what the researchers were comparing this to was some hypothetical kid, I guess, walking 3 miles an hour. I think we walk at about 4 miles an hour if we walk at a fast clip, most of us. I think even Harry Truman on his morning constitutionals probably hit 3.5 miles an hour. And what kid walks for extended periods of time at 3 miles an hour? You know how kids are when you take them out. I mean, the little ones stop and they pick up things and they put them in their, and it's like, come on. But they have all these treasures and great stuff. And then they'll run real fast, and you have to run to catch up with them, right? And they're all over the place. And the older kids, they don't walk sullenly at 3 miles an hour. They're just doing all kinds of stuff. If they're great kids, if they're doing what kids do, they're running and hiding and seeking and jumping and building and digging and getting dirty and muddy and I think all those things that kids don't do anymore. That's a very different kind of exercise. That's the kind of exercise many of us remember when we got home from school and we threw the books on the couch and we raced outside and we made up our own rules. We made up our own games. Or if you were like me, you raced into the field to your underground fort or built your tree house or any of those things. And you were in charge. And your buddies were in charge. The studies of obesity, one of the most interesting ones to me is one that was done by the University of Washington a couple years ago, University of Indiana, and Purdue. It looked at inner city neighborhoods, and they found that the greener the neighborhood, the lower the BMI, the better it was for child obesity. And the interesting thing, to me at least, the most interesting thing was they found that this was independent of population density. In other words, we don't all have to move to the countryside or the suburbs. We just have to think about our neighborhoods, our urban neighborhoods differently. We have to build different kinds of neighborhoods that are greener. It is possible to build neighborhoods with higher human density and more natural habitat, but we have to create that natural habitat, not just conserve. So the study that was done, it's one more study. I wonder about that study. I think it's good news that kids can jump around in front of a video game, and that's probably better for them than sitting on the couch in front of a video game. Not against that, that's great. But why are there so few studies of how the natural world affects child and human development? This is relatively new. This has been an ignored area in the academic world for a long time. There are over 1,000 studies that show the effects of certain pharmaceuticals on attention deficit disorder. There are about 10 or 12 on the effect of the natural world experience on the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. That is not because of the relative merit of those two areas. That's because of where the research money comes from. The other benefits, in terms of independent play, this has been disappearing along with the experience in nature. These two things are related. The disappearance of independent play and the disappearance of play in the natural world. Studies of how kids play in a natural play space compared to a flat turf or cement or asphalt playground. The kids in the natural play space are far more likely to invent their own games, more likely to be creative than the kids on the flat playground. In watching kids play in these two environments, they realize that the natural play space is far more inclusive. Girls are more likely to be playing in that natural space physically. Kids who are not keen on organized sports are far more likely to be playing in that natural space. Apparently, it even touches ethnicity and race in terms of more likely to be playing in that natural space. But the most important thing is that they're more creative. The leaders who emerge in these two environments tend to be different. The leaders in the flat playgrounds who emerge tend to be the physically strongest, which is good. It's good to be physically strong. The kids who emerge as leaders in the natural play space tend to be the smartest. So I think if we really care about bullying on the schoolyard, we'll green every schoolyard in America, if we really care about that. The study in California looked at 3 school districts that still had some kind of 6th grade camp like my county does in San Diego, a week of immersion in nature. And that camp, by the way, is now threatened by the budget cuts. It's been there for, I think, 40 years. It's a tradition in San Diego, and it's on the chopping block right now. What they found is that the kids, the so-called at-risk kids, in those settings do 26% better on science testing than they do in a typical classroom. And yet, what have we been doing? We've been, in the 70s, we started putting up schools with no windows. You know, the architects who built those schools in California, some of those same people who build schools are literally the same people who build prisons. And when this was going on, and not having windows, the architects would say, oh, no, there's windows. See that slit at the top of the wall? That's the vision strip, they called it. What are we thinking? What are we thinking when we create these environments like so many of the planned communities? They may be green, but just try to step on the green. You know, just try to put up a basketball hoop in some of those communities, let alone let the kids build a treehouse or a fort. It's not going to happen. One woman told me that her community association outlawed chalk drawing on the sidewalks. And just when I think I've heard the most egregious example of this, I hear another one. In North Carolina, a couple told me that their community association decided there were too many flower pots in front of the houses, so they came up with a new regulation that said you could only have 3 flower pots in front of your house, and they could only be 10 inches across. You know, flower pots, the enemy within. I mean, what are we thinking? In Florida, big counties, Broward County, one of the biggest, most populous counties in the country, school districts started putting up no running signs on the playgrounds. I bet those same schools are handing out brochures to the parents after school about child obesity. What are we thinking? What kind of society are we building? Not only for these kids, but for ourselves. Early on, right after the book came out, I was speaking in Florida, and a woman stood up later and said, and it was a Q&A question at that time, she says, "At what point did we go insane?" And I said, "That's a good research question." One more example that this is under research. The benefits, and I won't go on too long about the benefits, but the benefits are tremendous for psychological health, for physical health, and I believe, and this is untestable, for spiritual health. One of the things that surprised me after the book came out is that I thought I was going to get a lot of grief from the religious right, from the far religious right, not everybody on the religious right, but because I had a chapter near the end of the book called The Spiritual Necessity of Nature for Children. And I really anticipated that there would be a lot of criticism because some folks believe that somebody like me is going to come along and try to get their kids to worship nature. Now, I understand their concern. I don't agree with it, but I respect that they have this concern. I was very careful with the chapter. I have a very conservative Christian friend who read the chapter. She's quoted in it. I still worried about this. As it turned out, I've gotten nothing, no resistance. Well, actually, the other day somebody wrote a blog and they were criticizing Newt Gingrich as being a radical environmentalist, partly because he quoted my book. Somewhere I went wrong. I don't know. Anyhow, I appreciate it being quoted. But the religious right hasn't attacked me. In fact, one of the first champions of the book was the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. The 700 Club, you know, Pat Roberts' show on the Christian Broadcasting Network asked me to be on their program. One of our members of our board, the Children Nature Network, is the national youth leader for the Sierra Club, and he said, "Don't go, it's a trap." But I went. I said, I got a good feeling. I think it's going to be okay. And I went, and I did the interview in D.C. It was pre-recorded, and I was really proud of myself. I thought I'd done really great and really puffed up. And I went out, and I was standing on the street in D.C., and I looked down, and I realized that my zipper had been down for the entire Christian Broadcasting Network interview. You know those moments in life where your position in the universe becomes very clear? That was one of them. My wife hates it when I tell that story, but it's true. But they did a great job, despite the fact that my zipper was down on the Christian Broadcasting Network. They did a great job with the piece. Pat Robertson said good things about this issue. I didn't know how primal and universal this issue was. I learned pretty soon that it didn't matter what somebody's religion or politics are. They almost always want to tell me about the treehouse they had when they were a kid, if they're old enough to have had that experience. I gave congressional testimony a few years ago. One of the things that came out of this was the No Child Left Inside Act. Which was designed to get more money to environmental educators through the states. It passed in the House and then stalled in the Senate. There's a new bill that's been introduced that's like that. I don't remember the name of it. But I gave congressional testimony before this bill was written. And there were three of us giving congressional testimony. This was the Interior Appropriations Committee. And there were 6 Congress people there. I'm told that's a good turnout. And the three of us were asked to give testimony about long-term trends. What stunned me, and I guess I'm naive, was I was told later that that was the first time that that committee had last asked for testimony about long-term trends. They almost always look only at the next fiscal year. 2 other people gave testimony. One was the head of the Nature Conservancy nationally. The other one was the chief biologist for NatureServe, which was a group that keeps track of endangered species and other species. I was the only one without PowerPoint, and I was last, so I thought I was dead in the water in terms of having any time. But they made some extra time. Afterwards, the congressman, who ranged from very, very conservative to very, very liberal, asked a few perfunctory questions about acreage and species. And then all they wanted to talk about was their special place in nature when they were kids. And you couldn't shut them up. In those moments, there were no Democrats in the room. There were no Republicans in the room, just 6 men. They were all men with a shared memory, and they didn't want to be in the last generation to have that memory, or at least in the last generation where that memory was considered normal, the norm. I often do talk about my own boyhood in nature, which was I'm often asked, why did you write this book? And I can come up with some great journalistic answers, but the true reason is that as a boy, I thought it saved me. And I go into why that's true in the new book. I won't talk about that tonight. But I did think that it had saved me. I had great parents who were wonderful in many ways and gave me the gift of nature. They had some other problems. But I was given that gift. I could go out my backyard through the hedge at the end of the yard, into the cornfield where my underground fort was, and then from there on into the woods and the fields and the farms. It seemed to go on forever. And I explored them hours and hours and hours, often alone with my collie, my dog named Banner. I had an intense sense of ownership of those woods. Those were my woods. Those were my woods. I'll bet some of you had that feeling. I had such a sense of ownership of those woods that as an 8-year-old, I believe I pulled out hundreds of survey stakes that I knew had something to do with the bulldozers that were taking out other woods. I have to tell you, a couple of years ago, a developer told me I would have been a lot more effective if I'd simply moved the stakes around. Don't try this at home much. But I had that sense of ownership. A few years ago, I was speaking to a group called the Quivira Coalition, a really interesting group that I actually write about in the Nature Principle, that is bringing together ranchers, often conservative ranchers, with environmentalists, and they're doing land trusts together, et cetera, to protect open spaces, but also to protect the ranching lifestyle. And people have different feelings about the ranching life in terms of its impact on the environment, but these people are coming together in the West. After I spoke, we had the Q&A session, and a guy stood up in the audience. He was an older guy. He was in his 60s. I'm in my 60s now, so that's not old anymore. And he stood up, and he had a white handlebar mustache, and he was sunburned, and he had jeans on. He was the real deal. His jeans had not been acid washed. He had thick-rimmed plastic glasses, and he said, you know that, he was a rancher. Half of the people in the room, by the way, were wearing cowboy hats. And he said, you know that story you told about pulling out stakes? And I said, yes. And he said, I did that when I was a boy. Mm-hmm. And then he began to cry in front of 500 people, half of whom were wearing cowboy hats. And despite his deep sense of embarrassment, he continued to talk about his sense of grief, that his generation might be one of the last to have that kind of sense of ownership of land. And it has nothing to do with money. It has to do with knowing where you are, knowing where you stand, that below you is land, and above you is sky, and that you belong there, and it is yours, and you are its. A little while later, I was signing books, and another rancher came up. She was a young woman in her 40s. That's really young to me now. And she said, you know that story you told about pulling out stakes? And I said, yes. She said, I did that when I was a girl, too. She said, but I did it different. I did it from my horse. And my horse got so used to me pulling out stakes that it started taking me over to the stakes. And I would reach down and pull out that stake. That sense of ownership, that sense of belonging. Now, some people don't like that word ownership when it comes to nature. I understand that, but I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about belonging, being owned and owning, the sense of place and time. So often when we talk about the environment, and this is a little bit about the new book, and I'll talk more about the new book in the question and answer period, if you don't mind. We talk in technical language. I have a good friend, he's a psychiatrist. He's one of the folks that started this Ocean to the Mountains Park. They're buying up land and land trust, et cetera. It's going to be wonderful, wonderful trail, many miles up into the mountains in San Diego. And his house is amazing. He's got solar panels everywhere. He's off the grid. He's actually selling energy to California. He will talk about that as he will his Prius until the sun sets, and about how exactly to drive a Prius so you get the maximum. And there's all kinds of tricks. Feathering the gas pedal. I know. I've got a hybrid too. But in infinite detail, he will talk about his solar panels. He will talk about BTUs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's wonderful to listen to. I'm really glad he's saving money. I'm really glad he's saving energy. But I said, well, Chris, he's a psychiatrist member. I said, Chris, how does it make you feel? And he said, well, I'm saving these BTU. I'm saving that. And he starts reeling out these numbers. I go, no, Chris, tell me, how does it make you feel? Well, and then he starts again with the numbers. I stop it, Chris. What happens inside you when you're doing that? And he stopped, and he thought about it for a while, and he said, what it makes me feel is that I know my place in time. I know my place in time. I was in Australia recently, where the Children of Nature movement is spreading. At the beginning of almost every public event now, the indigenous people of that place, of that land, who have that sense of ownership and belonging of land, they wouldn't use the word ownership, but they have that. This is a ritual now in Australia. They will come up and open these big events like this. There would have been a couple of indigenous folks, and they will talk about this land, and they'll say land every third sentence, the land, the land, the land. And they'll talk about their ancestors and the ancestors to come and the land, the land. It has a very peculiar effect on the audiences. They become very serious and solemn, and they listen. The land, the land. They know their place in time. They are filled with something, some indescribable it. I opened the nature principle with a story of going to New Mexico with my wife and first son years ago. We'd had a particularly stressful time. My mother was very ill. We'd had some economic hardship or difficulties. And we just needed an escape. So we have a friend in New Mexico. My wife volunteered at a hospital there years ago. And he says she saved his life. She held his arms down when the anesthesia wore off, when she diagnosed his appendicitis, and he probably would have died. She denies that, of course. This friend of mine used to be a communist, and a very devoted communist, living in this little valley in New Mexico. And now he's a Christian Catholic literalist. We often have arguments, then and now. And when we fish, he taught me to fly fish 30 years ago. But when he was sick, he was halfway done with a new room, and the wall was open in this little adobe house in a little valley called Puerto de Luna with dirt roads down through it. And I didn't have anything to do. My wife was volunteering, and I was along for the ride. So I went down and helped him. For a couple weeks, we just made adobes. Because the winter was coming. He had to fill that wall, and he couldn't do it with his operation. I loved making those adobes. It was so great. It was so cool. Adobe in a pit, really the original way. And we would make adobes, and it was very hot. And then we'd go sit underneath the cottonwood tree. And his wife would bring out green chili from the field, his own field, that she had made on the wood stove in the middle of the summer when it's 105. And the hot green chili is actually good to eat at that point. It cools you down because you sweat a lot. And we would sit under the cottonwood tree, and we would eat green chili and argue about politics. And later, when he taught me how to fly fish, we would go down to the stream, and we would fish for a while. And then we'd go up to the end of the stream, and we would sit, and we would argue about a great guy. His name is Nick Raven. Great name. He had this ranch. He and his wife and kids had this little tiny adobe ranch. They were gone that summer, so my wife and I drove there with our son, and I remember my son and wife went into the house. I went into the house with them, and I went around, I turned on the water. I don't think there was electricity then, but I turned on the water, went into the sink, into the kitchen, and tested it, and about a foot-long centipede came shooting up into my face, and I was the one with the steak knife. So that was startling. And then I went outside, and I sat under that same cottonwood tree on the same folding metal chair that I had sat on years ago when I'd sat there and argued with Nick about politics. And I watched the rim of trees along the Pecos River at the end of his property. I watched the cottonwoods move. And I picked out one in particular, and I watched it for 2 hours. It didn't move for 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, I just felt all of this stress go out of me, just like that centipede. And I felt something else move into me. And I don't know what it is. I call it the it. We have a human right to that, I believe. In the Nature Principle, I asked the question, as I did in an essay for Orion magazine a couple of years ago. I started asking my friends, most of whom are environmentalists, do we have a right to a walk in the woods? Do our kids have a right to a walk in the woods? And it really irritated them, that question. And I kept asking them, and some of the reasons that they gave, I understood. One more reason to sue each other. Great, I understand that. But the more they talked about it, the more I realized how similar their response was to that question as some folks on the right respond to that question. In both cases, they are looking at nature as the other, as separate from human beings. The environmentalists, some of them, We have a tendency to say, why should human beings have a right to nature? Look what we're doing to it. And we have a point in saying that. People on the right will say, some of them, the religious right, will say, nature really doesn't count. It's there for our dominion, and at best it's a nice stepping stone on the way to real paradise. In both cases, nature is the other. The truth is, we are nature. Nature is us. We belong. It is us. We own it. It owns us. And to the extent that we separate ourselves from that truth, we guarantee that we will destroy nature. That's why I think we have a human right to this. If E.O. Wilson is right, the biophilia hypothesis, that we are hardwired to love and appreciate nature. If the studies are right that back him up, like one study that looked at images that human beings are attracted to, one after another. They did this study on every continent, in urban areas, in cities, in rural areas. Human beings are most attracted, of all the images we can choose, we're most attracted to images of nature. And of those landscapes, the number one image we are attracted to as a species is the savanna. The savanna. An open area, trees out there a little bit, some human habitation within sight, open nature. Where did we come from? I don't know if that proves that we're hardwired genetically, but that it is in us. I talk about a little girl, and I'll end here and then we'll go on the Q&A, in Last Child, and I write about her again in The Nature Principle because what she said was so striking to me. And I expand on this when I talk about this issue of do we have a right to walk in the woods. The little girl was in a classroom in my own grade school where I went to school outside of Kansas City in Raytown, Missouri. I remember going to the school, and they were going to arrange for me to interview a class full of kids. I walked in, it hadn't changed. The same linoleum squares were on the floor, the same teachers were there, same haircuts. They hadn't changed a bit. Exactly, it was the same teachers. They hadn't gone gray or anything. Rod Serling was somewhere in there. And I go into the classroom, and I remember sitting there as a kid, watching the line of trees outside the window and watching them wave in the spring and feeling that it then. And hearing a voice somewhere saying, "Richie, will you pay attention?" I often say that, nature was my Ritalin, the woods were my Ritalin. I'm sure I would have been put on it. Two classrooms of kids came in. They sat down. The teacher said, "These are great kids. They probably go outside into nature more than the typical school." And indeed they did. One little girl, they told me, was, as the teacher put it, she's our little poet. And indeed, she stood up and spoke about her feeling about the woods. And she said, "When I am in the woods, I feel that I am in my mother's shoes. When I am in the woods, I feel that I am in my mother's shoes." And she said she had a special place in nature. It was in her woods. It was below her favorite tree, a big oak tree, and a little hollowed out place where she would go and she would lie and she would look up at the sky and the moving clouds beyond the leaves, and she would think of her poetry. And she said, "One day I went down there and my tree was gone and my special place was gone and the blanket that I put in that little hole was gone." And she said, "When they cut down my tree, they cut down part of me." I don't think she was speaking metaphorically. I think she was speaking literally. if E.O. Wilson is right, if the biophilia hypothesis is right, if this research is emerging is correct, then this connection to nature, to this it, whatever it is fundamental to our humanity. And we have a right to that which is fundamental to our humanity. So I don't think that little girl had a right to that, a legal right to that particular tree or whatever, but she had a right to a connection with nature. Kids in the inner city have a right to a connection with nature, not just a right to live in a neighborhood without toxins being dumped in it, but a right to what nature gives children of itself, that it helps them be healthier and smarter and psychologically better off and happier and to feel more alive. All of us have a right to that connection to nature. And if we lose that connection, if we dismiss it, we will surely continue down this road to the destruction of nature. Thank you.
Please stay for a question and answer if you'd like. There's a mic at the back in the center aisle and one at the front, and perhaps we could alternate questioners. If you would like to speak from your seat, we can bring you a handheld mic if you raise your hand. We'll have about 20-25 minutes of questions, and then Mr. Louv will sign books in the lobby at the table just on your way out of the space. So I see people lined up already. I'll give you back Mr. Louv.
Yes.
I'm a preschool teacher and do not have much opportunity to use microphones. I'm really touched by all the stories you talk about adults talking about their childhood, and I regularly listen to NPR and the StoryCorps Project, and I was wondering if you would consider contacting the StoryCorps Project people and to see if we can put in our National Archives the stories of connections with nature as a possible theme for them to use one of the years when they go around recording stories, in addition to the stories they're already recording, because in case this is endangered, we would have something for our children to put in their iPods and listen to if they don't actually get to connect with their real trees. So
I think it's a wonderful idea. Something like that has been suggested. I think that's wonderful. And back here, the mic back there.
Yes, is this working? Yeah,
Yes.
Okay, good. My name is Michael, and I was a school teacher in the 60s, the PE teacher, and I gave some choices to the students in the PE class, and the other teachers didn't like it because I was a drill sergeant, so I quit. But now I'm into permaculture and homesteading revised, organic farming meets homesteads and so on, kind of hippie-like. But anyway, I've been looking at how ecology is taught in the schools, and as far as I can tell, it isn't, except for they have these gardens. We do have gardens in some of the schools here. So I was wondering if you would speak about any of that, and how is ecology either scientific or dirty hand style creeping into the schools, or do the kids just one kid in a class get to go to the garden?
Well, I'm sure as some of the environmental educators here will tell you, they're an endangered species right now too. And we really need to support them. We really need to support the programs that get kids out of that school in particular. Not all environmental education happens outside the classroom. In fact, a lot of it stays in the classroom. I think that there's a real case to be made that what kids lack most is not information about nature. They watch the Animal Planet. They see a lot of, much more. They can tell you anything about the Amazon rainforest. I couldn't have told you anything about the Amazon rainforest when they were a kid, but what they can't tell you is about the last time they went out in the woods and just watched the leaves move. They can't tell you about the animals that live in their own backyard. So I think there's a real case to be made that what kids are missing most is not information but experience. And that to the extent that we can give them that, the studies show that all test grades can be helped with most kids if you get them outdoors. In fact, for teachers, there's a study in Canada that shows that teachers who get their students outdoors and go with them, they don't burn out as early. Yes.
Hi. I want to just thank you for your work. And I'm come as a mother with a question. I've already read a lot of your work and appreciate it, and I'm already there with you. And my question is, how do we bridge where we are and the suggestion, the world and the vision that you're bringing? I have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and even though I'm in a beautiful small city, the culture of parenting now is such that you do not let your kids hang out outside or go off of your property, even though I would like that. So that's sort of the first barrier. The second is there's a lot more homework than when I grew up. And on the playground, the other parents are not even always in agreement with me that that's something that needs to be changed. So I'm curious about, as a parent, how to go forward.
I don't know how true this still is, but certainly in the beginning, and still every now and then, I heard a lot of parents say that they were under intense social pressure from other parents if they let their kids go in the woods or whatever. I remember one woman in particular, the family had deliberately picked a house with woods at the end of the yard. And every summer they encouraged their kids to go out, set up tents, and spend as much time out there as they wanted. And the kids would go out there, and then they would run into the refrigerator and get food or Coke or whatever, and then they'd run back out to the thing. One day, another parent showed up at their door, and she said, "What are you doing, letting your kids go into the woods like that and spend all that time?" And the woman said, "Well, it's really good for them. It's good for their health. It's good for their mental attitude and all of that." And the visiting woman said, "Oh, you're such a liberal." I've heard a lot of definitions of a liberal, but letting your kids experience nature is a new one. But the pressure that she felt, and I've heard that a lot. One thing I think we need to do, and I write about this in a chapter in The Nature Principle, is for ourselves, for our families, and again, this is for ourselves as much as it is for our kids, I believe, as parents. When parents, any guardian, good guardian, grandparents that takes a child into nature, a teacher, they receive all the same benefits, the better attention span probably, the antidote to some extent to obesity, the stress reduction, certainly the stress reduction. They receive all the same benefits that the child does immediately. We can't just be nostalgic about the time when parents said, "Go outside and don't come back until the streetlights come on." That day is not going to return in most neighborhoods. Some it might. So what can we do? Mainly about the fear. Yes, homework is part of the reason. Yes, bad urban planning is part of the reason. We tell kids to get outside and do what? Go where? Walk where? And parents are justifiably worried about traffic. But the number one thing they are afraid of is strangers, is human beings out there. And that's what parents talk about with the most sense of intensity. And that's why parents feel, I believe, this social pressure from other parents who somehow letting your kids play in nature is a form of child neglect. You're putting your kids in danger. So going back to that 50s or 60s isn't going to happen. So we have to actually create new ways to connect our families, our kids, to nature. One of them, just one, is something that the Children's Nature Network has been promoting called the Family Nature Club. This started a few years ago, or 3 years ago, when a parent, a father and second grade teacher in Roanoke, Virginia, emailed me and said that he and his wife had read Last Child and some other stuff, and they got inspired. They started getting their kids out on weekends and going to the park and going on hikes on Saturdays, et cetera, et cetera. And one day, the 5-year-old said, "Dad, how come we're the only family having this much fun?" So he started inviting other families. And what these families did was arrange essentially nature play dates. On Saturday, they'd all agree. Sometimes they made these arrangements by computer. There's actually a family nature club in Rhode Island that has an app that the parents use to arrange to meet at the I think it's a great thing, to meet at the park on Saturday and take a hike or do gardening or whatever. The guy who wrote me, his family nature club now has 600 families as members. Many of these family nature clubs, and I think there's about 100 of them now, have several hundred families, not individuals, families. What this new kind of way, which probably is old, probably people did it in the past, but what this way does is several things. First off, it deals with the fear issue to an extent because there's at least perceived safety in numbers. Secondly, any kind of family can do this. So think how great this would be for single-parent families who face all kinds of logistical issues. Think how great this would be for families, parents who want that for their kids but didn't get it when they were kids. And they don't have a clue as to where to start. They can team up with families that know how. Any kind of economic group, any kind of neighborhood, any kind of ethnicity this can work for. And you don't have to wait for funding. You can do it yourself, and you can do it now. So there's a free toolkit on the website that you can download to make your own family nature club. That's just one example of doing things differently than we did them when we were kids. And it doesn't mean that the way we did it was better. In fact, there's a lot to be said for these family nature clubs because they build social cohesion among the adults as well, so there's some other benefits. And just let me add that one might think, well, isn't that supervised? How can the kids play independently? The guy who first wrote me said that when he and his wife would do that only with their kids, the kids would clutch to them and complain and all of that. The minute they asked other families, then all the kids were off running, they were hiding, they were seeking, they were digging, they were, making up their own games and all of that. So they may not have been playing alone, but they were playing like kids. And that happened when they asked more families. So that's one way to do it. Back here?
Thank you. My question is, first of all, I believe the same as you seem to, that cities are an incredibly unhealthy environment, and that a large part of the unhealth inherent in cities is the fact that they separate us from a full use of our own senses and overwhelm us to the degree that we are curling in on ourselves. And my question is, to what degree do you think that the benefits of getting out in nature and experiencing that environment could be gleaned by also being aware fully of our environment when we are in cities? Is it possible, even in an unhealthy environment, to have a full understanding of our surroundings and our place in it, encourage health?
I think I understand your question. I think that nearby nature is just as important as wilderness. There's a group here called Nearby Nature. And there's a group called, correct me if I'm wrong, the Children and Nature, what is it? Not Coalition. The Children and Nature Partnership, which is one of these 80 campaigns that have emerged around the country to get kids outdoors, and it's a great one, so get involved with that, please. I think that nearby nature in our cities, and much of what the nature principle is about, is reimagining our cities. We can actually live in wonderful cities. Our workplaces, if infused with nature, can be great places. The studies that show biophilic architecture, which takes green architecture to the next step, shows that the buildings that people work in if they've been designed with nature in mind from the beginning and then kept there, they're far more productive, sick time goes down, turnover gets better. So these companies are actually producing human energy, not just saving energy, which is we got to do. Our cities can be that way. Where we live can be that way. It can be down the street. It can be in our backyard. We can have natural plants in our backyard. Our kids can bring back butterfly migration routes if the natural history hands out the right seeds to us, et cetera, et cetera. We can really have these wonderful cities. Some of the experimentation in this, the pioneering experimentation, is happening in Oregon. Portland's one of the leaders. Yes.
You largely answered my question with the last mom, and thank you for that. But so I will add two things. One is that there's this great organization called Green Hearts. It's in Kansas. And one of the things that they've done is they created this brochure to show you what you can do in your own backyard to make it more explorable. Because that's sort of one of the problems I'm having, is that I actually don't mind letting my kids go wherever, except they're only 5 and 2, so I have to be sort of careful. But I live in this place where I can bike everywhere, and so I'm constantly struggling between those things. And the other thing I wanted to say, I've completely forgotten. So I just want to say thanks. I appreciate it.
Thanks. You know, there's one of the chapters in the Nature Principle, and it focuses on one guy in particular who's written this great book, but the idea that conservation alone isn't enough. That we're actually, in order to have the biodiversity we need, we're actually going to have to create nature. As ironic as that sounds, we're going to have to green our cities, green our yards, et cetera. And he makes the case that the only way we're going to have the biodiversity we need is what if we transformed most of the backyards and front yards and did away with Kentucky bluegrass and planted native species, which would bring back the insects, that would bring back the butterfly and bird migrations, et cetera. And these can be very beautiful yards. And a lot of people doing that, changing where they live. And I call that following the nature principle. Are back here?
I'm kind of nervous. But I'm a junior in the College of Education, the undergrad program, and so I come sort of representing future teachers. And my response to what you're saying is, even though I agree with what you're arguing, I still enter the profession really hopeful and excited about taking my future students into the woods. And so I guess my question is, how have the responses from the early childhood community been different in urban settings versus more rural communities like Eugene?
It's tougher, obviously, to do this in urban centers. I mean, how many child care facilities or early childhood education places, are basically a concrete slab surrounded by chain link fence. I mean, we've all seen those. It is not easy. There was a study that was done, I think in South Carolina, that found that something like 86% of the time that kids spend in preschool is sedentary. Even outside, when they take the kids outside, 56% of the time that kids spend outside is sedentary. So clearly we've got a real problem with early childhood, and that's only one of the many problems that certainly early childhood educators face, along with the fact that we pay them less than the people who operate kennels. But it is possible. It is possible. I mean, partnering with botanical gardens, partnering with natural history museums, partnering with farmers and ranchers. I mean, I make the case in the Nature Principle that farms and ranches could be the new schoolyards. They're already doing that in Norway, where kids are taken out there part of the year, and they have a very different experience. So that could start very early. The good news is that there's more and more interest in what are sometimes called nature preschools. In Europe, they're called forest schools. And they get pretty extreme in Western Europe. In Germany, for instance, They have preschools that don't have any buildings at all. So I'm not sure I'm advocating that, but some great things are happening in this area, including the United States.
Hi, so as a board member of Nearby Nature, I just want to say thanks for the shout out and more information at nearbynature.org. We're also starting a family club network here locally, so make sure and get involved in that way. I'm also a library science student, and so I guess I come to this from the perspective of the role of information in society, and I was really interested during your lecture thinking about the way in which we privilege certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of information over others in our K through 12 education system, in academic life, and in the corporate world. I've never gone to a job interview and been asked, tell us about your connection to nature.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absent. So I guess, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in the nature principle, I pay a lot of attention to business. It's all the way through the book, but one of the chapters is literally called the nature principle in business. I think that there's business health to be found in this area, not only through the architecture and the design of workplaces, but through the use of nature for retreats, et cetera, and that combined with greater awareness of how products are made in terms of recycling and all of that, that's a powerful combination. You're not only at that point saving energy, you're producing human energy. So I think there's a good case to be made for that. In fact, and I talked about this earlier to a group, I'd like there to be someday, soon, a career guide to connecting people to nature. And the reason I say that is often people in college or high school will come up to me afterwards or raise their hand and say, okay, I decided to change my major. What do I do? What school do I go to? What kind of career? And I don't have great answers for them. It should be easy to answer that. It's not. What if in universities, maybe this one, there was an umbrella area called Connecting People to Nature, a program that you would go through and then later decide how you're going to do it, that all kinds of professions can connect people to nature. Educators can, pediatricians can, architects can, urban planners can, political scientists can, or policymakers can. All kinds of professions can actually connect people to nature. Right now, when you think about that, you mainly think about forest rangers and environmental educators, but this could touch almost every business. And one of the things that I've noticed of the young people when they come up and talk to me about this, they have a different look in their eyes than the young people who come up and talk only about sustainability. And when I say only, I mean not that sustainability isn't important. It's vital. We have to do it. But in the narrowest definition, in how people perceive that word, it's about stasis. No self-respecting, creative 16-year-old is interested in stasis. They want to create something new. And neither is the creative 16-year-old in you interested in stasis. The kids who come up and talk about that brand of sustainability kind of talk about it like my friend the psychiatrist in a technical language. The kids who come up and talk about a career someday connecting people to nature in any of these ways, there's a joy in their eyes, an excitement in their eyes, kind of like little Ansel Adams on that beach, and it's a very different look. So I'd love to do whatever I can, whatever we can, to encourage that. 5 minutes back here.
My question is about adults, really. After an acute nature deficit experience of my own, in an extended stay in the hospital, I started noticing how popular apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic themes and stories were in cinema and literature. And I began wondering, is that a symptom of nature deficit disorder? It's like enough already. Yeah. I've had this barrage of artificial stimulus, and
No, absolutely. I mean, I wish I had more time to talk about that, but I think that for some time now, we have had two lethal addictions. One is to oil, and the other is to despair. And, ultimately, there's no practical alternative to hope. Martin Luther King said in many ways that any culture, any movement will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. We've been failing at the painting of that picture. We've been so apocalyptic, everything is dystopic. We're in love with that. We're in love with the dystopic future. I mean, how are we going to get a better future if we're in love with the dystopic future? If we're addicted to despair? The time for that is over. Yes, global warming exists. Yes, there will be difficult times ahead. But we can build a better society if it is as immersed in nature as it is in technology. I tell this story sometimes about a cruise ship he was a teacher of pilots, future pilots of cruise ships. And he said, I get two kinds of students. One is the kind of student who grew up in only doing video games. And that student is great with all the electronics. They're terrific, and we need that. The other kind of student I have is the kind that grew up hunting or fishing or outside hiking in nature. I need that kind of student too, because that student knows where the ship is. He literally said that. And what he meant by, and it's this spatial thing, knowing somehow its connectedness in the universe. And he said, what he said was great. He said, I need students who can do both. Why aren't we training students to do both? And in Nature Principle, I call that the hybrid mind. Again, this isn't just a negation of technology. We have to look at it differently and find a sense of balance. And I think nature is the best balance that we can give to some of the bad effects of technology, so that some of the good ones can come out more. 2 minutes and 3 people. Mike, how about if I don't talk and you just say what you're going to say?
Well, I'll be as succinct as I can be. I actually came up with 2 questions, and the second speaker up at this mic asked the question I was going to ask about the bridging the gap. And I wanted to make one quick comment about that, is that I read a fact a few years ago that even though child abductions have gone down, reporting about them have gone up by 400% to 600%. So like this, again, this paranoia and this fear, but I talk to people all the time from my generation or older that say they got to stay out until the lights came on. And so again, I'm interested in that. I think you addressed that, unless you have more to say about it.
Yeah, I actually write about that in Last Child, more about that in the Nature Principle.
Nature.
The fact is that even though we feel more and more fear, violence toward children outside the home has actually been going down for about 20 years. Child abductions have been going out. The vast majority of child abductions are not strangers or somebody the family knows or a relative. The reason that the fear is going up is largely the fault, or my profession needs to own some of that.
Sensationalized media.
Yeah, I mean, all you have to do is watch CNN or Fox, and you'll see how they take a handful of terrible crimes against children and repeat them over and over and over again. That's the very definition of conditioning. Some people think this is a conspiracy. I don't, because that would attribute too much institutional intelligence to my profession.
But so my other comment was, how can we transfer? I see that that was just a comment I was making. How can we transfer? I went on a mushroom foray last fall by one of the preeminent mushroom writers, David Aurora, in the North America, and he said something that I had already felt, that like my son is into Legos, and he can tell you every character and every color and every style. He said, we have a need to classify, and we want to. And if we could transfer, we all know these types of cell phones or these types of car models, and if we can transfer that onto something nature-based. And so, we have the field guides, and we take them to that, but that isn't what he's asking to see. He's asking to see Lego.com. So
I agree.
How can you transfer that?
That would take a long time to answer.
Yeah.
How about you back there? There's two more people, and I'll be quiet.
Thank you. As an environmental studies student at the U of O, I have been familiarized with lots of different philosophies regarding humans' relationship with nature. One philosophy that's I have found to be pretty prevalent is the distinction of nature as something separate from society. And in relation with that idea is the idea that if some things are designated as nature, other things are not nature. And so I'm wondering, as a means to better develop and implement better environmental education programs, what is your definition of nature?
I struggle with that in the book. I'll just say this as briefly as I can. There's no accident that we've left the definition of nature up to the poets. Scientists don't like trying to define nature for a lot of reasons. And in fact, it's created a kind of blind spot in research in terms of what they look at and its effect on, for instance, brain architecture development in children, early childhood. My personal definition is that when I am in the presence and appreciate that presence of other species other than my own. It's that simple. And it can be in my backyard, it can be in a park, it can be in the wilderness. But that's again, poets have mainly been the definers of nature, and they're better at it than sciences.
Okay, last question. I'm a mother of 3 young boys, and I send them out constantly. But one of the pressures parents get, I think, is what I call the soccer culture.
Yeah.
So good parenting means driving your kids around to soccer games. And I've withdrawn completely from that culture, but that is 99% of the people, even here in Eugene. How do you respond to that?
I'm not against soccer. Organized sports is a good thing, to an extent. But we have to remember that the greatest increase in child obesity in our history occurred during the same 2 decades as the greatest increase in organized sports for children in our history. It's not working. So that's my basic answer. Anyhow, thank you very much.
Please turn in your comment sheets and please join us in the lobby for the book signing if you'd like to. Thank you for coming.